Very glad to have him back with us today during the month of Pride, just so that we can be paying attention to the greater communities that we have within the Twin Cities area, within our own church. And Cody is a very articulate individual to speak to these issues. So thank you, Cody.
Thanks for having me back. Always a pleasure to be at Mount Olive, a congregation that I've come to love in this last year or so. I first showed up here for a visit almost a year ago this month. And I've joined you many times since then, so thanks for having me back. So I got into my work, my academic work, really at the intersection of LGBTQ concerns and theology. So just as a little bit of an autobiographical background beyond what I do and where I teach, I'll tell you a little about how I got into this in my life. I grew up in a little town in the upstate of South Carolina, a pretty conservative area of the country, in a Southern Baptist church where all my family had lived all my family had been members for generations. I grew up loving the church because of the organ. I loved the organ as a kid. The organist would let me sit with her while she played, eventually gave me some lessons and let me play a little prelude or something at our Sunday night services. Good. I loved the church because of church music. You can see why I love coming to Mount Olive. And loved going to church because I wanted to hear the choir and the organ. And I loved church as a kid, 5-year-old, 6-year-old kid, so much that I begged my father and grandfather to build me a church in my backyard, which eventually, I just noticed I've distracted you have Duke's mayonnaise back there.
That was just for you.
Duke's mayonnaise is from Greenville, South Carolina, right here where I grew up, and it's the best mayonnaise
And
ever.
what was the name of the town?
Duncan, South
Duncan.
Carolina. Yeah, you know that part.
Well, we were in Columbia for 3 years.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
My grandmother's from Minneapolis.
Oh, really? Wow.
Lake Hartwell.
Yes, I spent a lot of time on Lake Hartwell as a teenager. Well, my dad and grandfather eventually did build me a church in my backyard. They were both contractors. It was like, a little chapel that sat maybe 8 people. We got a stained glass window out of our real church's basement that was just sitting down there, put it in. My grandfather built a steeple. My grandmother sewed me a little robe and stole. My other grandfather would come up after school and play church with me in the backyard. So I grew up loving the church and also imagining my life lived in service to the church. And I also grew up during that same time knowing something about my own sense of same-sex attraction, though I had no language to put to that as a kid. I didn't know anyone else experienced that. I mean, this is how most LGBTQ kids sort of come to an awareness of our own sense of sexuality or gender identity, thinking that we must be the only ones because our parents are likely straight, our aunts and uncles and grandparents. And I grew up in a place where I knew no out LGBTQ person until I was probably 18 or so, maybe older. So was coming to understand something about my own embodiment of sexuality all by myself. I really didn't have anyone to talk to about this because even though my church didn't really preach anti-LGBTQ messages, otherwise I might have at least known something about LGBTQ stuff, I somehow got the intuitive sense that it would be really bad for me to bring this into conversation. So I just didn't bring it up to anyone. Dealt with this on my own for a long time, trying to figure out the intersection of sexuality and Christian faith and my sense of call to ministry. Accessing books and things where I could later on in my adolescence and young adulthood. And coming to some sense of how these things were going to be put together in my own life. Later, I'll give you a brief biography from there. Later in college, started to have some more opportunity to explore. I went to a little college in North Carolina called Gardner-Webb, a little more moderate Baptist school, where I could do some exploration and ask questions that I didn't quite have room to ask before that. I met a man in college that I began dating after we were friends for about 3 years. Right after college, we began dating. We went on our first gay date to the art museum at Bob Jones University. I'm sure we're not the first gay couple to
On purpose?
That art museum, which has since closed and they've distributed the art, that art museum was probably the second best religious art museum I've ever seen, aside from the cloisters being the first. It was an incredible collection of art. But yeah, so Bob Jones was a part of my coming out process in an odd way. But when I went to seminary and found a church called Oakhurst Baptist Church in Atlanta that had been ordaining LGBTQ people for a long time before I showed up, where there were LGBTQ ministers in service there, I started to have my own sense of possibilities expanded, which is why I think a church like this is such good news to people, even people who have never shown up here on Sunday morning. Because I grew up and then in college was putting together some of these pieces about my sexuality and faith on my own, but I knew that there were churches out there, churches that I had heard of, like Oakhurst in Atlanta, and Myers Park Baptist Church in Charlotte, places I'd never been, but just knowing that they were there was good news to me. It was sustaining to me. So the work that you do here, and I don't know what all that work has been over the years, but the work that you have done here to become a place of inclusivity and belonging and justice for and with LGBTQ people is really, really good news. And it's likely saving people's lives, people's sense of faith and connection to God in ways that you will never even know. So I wanted to bring some conversation into this space today around LGBTQ identities. And then on the 23rd, when I'm back again, we're going to delve into learning from the wisdom of LGBTQ people who have been a part of the church's story for a very long time, even though we often don't know their stories. So I'll do some storytelling in that forum. But the reason I wanted to start with 101 and then go beyond is because many churches, including the church I pastored in Cambridge, which had been affirming of LGBTQ people since 1983, which had only had lesbian and gay pastors, and still to this day has only had lesbian and gay pastors, for 40 years. When I showed up there 9 years ago, I realized that a lot of the education they had done around LGBTQ concerns was maybe a decade or more old. And they needed some updating. And I think almost every church that has become an affirming congregation at some point in the last decade or more needs a little updating in their sense of what LGBTQ identities and lives and embodiments mean today. So I'm going to get us started with a few prompts, but then I want you to be able to ask whatever questions you want to ask in this space, because you might not have a lot of other spaces to ask the questions that you have. And we'll start with some terminology. Because terminology around LGBT concerns is always proliferating, and if you haven't caught up to that proliferation of terminology in the last even couple of years, you probably don't know what some of these words mean, so we're going to talk about them. The first is terminology related to sexual or affectional orientation. A lot of disciplines like in psychology and psychotherapy have started to use the term affectional orientation because it is indicative of the ways that our sexual and romantic attractions aren't just about sexual attraction, but they're also about our emotional attraction, our relational attraction, things of that nature. And of course, then the place where most churches that have become affirming in the last decade or more need some growth is in the terminology and embodiments around gender identity and expression. So first I want to ask you, what terminology do you already know that kind of goes in this sexual orientation bucket of terms? Speaking to whom we are attracted or how we experience romantic connection and attraction.
Gay, lesbian, straight,
Straight,
Heterosexual, homosexual,
bisexual, pansexual,
Demisexual, asexual.
asexual, demisexual. Good, yeah. Anything else you want to name? You got a lot of them. Now, for how many of you was one, at least one of those terms, an unknown term, or at least you don't know what it means?
Yeah.
Would you call out the terms that you don't recognize, the ones you don't know what they mean?
Pansexual.
Pansexual, demisexual, anything else? Demisexual, okay. All right, then we'll talk about those for sure. And then gender identity and expression. And this is really important. These are two different experiences, two different embodiments. Everybody has some sort of sexual or affectional orientation, and everybody has some sort of gender identity and expression. But these buckets of terms are talking about two different parts of our sense of who we are as sexual and gender people. What goes under gender identity and expression that you know?
All the pronouns.
Pronouns, yes. So the ways that we name our sense of gender,
Male, female.
right? Yep.
Non-binary.
Non-binary.
Transgender.
Transgender.
Cisgender.
Cisgender. Gender fluid. Maybe gender queer. Two-spirit. So there we got a lot of those. Now, for whom was one of those terms unfamiliar? Or at least you don't know what it means exactly. What were the unfamiliar terms that you heard?
Binary,
Gender fluid,
binary.
binary,
Cisgender.
not cisgender. Okay, great. Wow, we got a lot to.
You didn't put non-binary.
No, I didn't put it on that list, but it certainly goes in that category of gender identity and expression. I've got a good chart on the next slide that will get us some of those things too. I just want to name this piece of it. This is sort of the growing acronym that we often use, LGBTQIA, 2S+, et cetera, et cetera. Many other things can be added. And I recognize the fact that this is often really confusing for people, even for LGBTQIA 2S+ people, to know what all of these letters mean and how we understand those embodiments. But I just want to orient you toward that proliferation of terminology and letters in this acronym a bit differently, away from the sense of just shocked confusion and toward a sense of liberation, because I think that's what this growing vocabulary really indicates. For a really, really, really long time, LGBTQIA people have had our bodies and our experiences of sexuality and gender identity and romantic attraction, etc., named for us by powerful producers of discourse, the three primary ones: the church, medical psychiatry discourse, and legal discourse. Terms that have been used to talk about us, like homosexuality, which was not a term that LGBTQ people invented for ourselves. That was a term invented by the psychiatric discourse to describe something that was being observed in human sexuality, as was the term heterosexual. So as our bodies, our lives, our experiences were being named for us, we often had to just pick up whatever terminology was floating about. And oftentimes that terminology was constricting, oftentimes it was demeaning, oftentimes it was pathologizing, but we used it because it was what was available and what people recognized. But as we've been able to progressively name for ourselves what our own embodiment of sexuality and gender identity mean, what our own attraction to others mean, what our own gender expressions mean, of course the language has proliferated. And proliferated beyond those terms that were used to describe us toward terms that we could use to describe ourselves, which means a growing list of vocabulary, a growing acronym that's hard to keep up with. But when you get confused about the acronym and the vocabulary, I just want to invite you to remind yourself, this is a sign of liberation. This is a sign that people are being able to say for themselves what their human experience means, and not to depend on powerful producers of discourse like the ecclesial and the medical, psychiatric, and the legal discourse to describe for us what our experience means. So let's get into a few of these terms. This is a really great little graphic from the Trevor Project, which I would encourage you all to know something about and look up. Does anyone know the Trevor Project already? Oh, just about 3 people. Terrific. I'm glad to introduce you to the Trevor Project. Well, just briefly, Trevor is an organization that was founded to basically intervene in the situation of suicide among LGBTQ people, specifically youth and young adults. Trevor Project operates a helpline that someone can call if they're experiencing suicidality. They have experienced people on hand that can talk with a queer or trans youth about their suicidality or whatever the case. They also have a text line, a chat line, and one thing you'll see later on is that Trevor does some really incredible research on LGBTQ youth mental health. So you can go into the Trevor Project's website and click on research and read a lot of research they've done with sample sizes of about 28,000 LGBTQ youth per study that they do, and see a really good picture of the mental health concerns facing LGBTQ people. So they have this little spectrum chart here that I like because it shows us the ways that things like biological sex, which is basically what the doctor says about you when you're born, exists on a spectrum from male to intersex to female. And many people are born with an intersex identity, not only because the genitalia is intersex, but there are chromosomal ways of being intersex as well that we often don't talk about, because many times the parents and the doctors get together and decide what gender they're going to make for this person, which has caused a lot of pain in intersex people's lives over the years, and intersex identities are beginning to be talked about a lot more these days. Gender identity, this is basically your psychological and spiritual and emotional sense of gender, which might not be the gender that you were assigned by the doctor at birth. So your gender identity may span from male, which includes female to male transgender people, to female, which includes male to female transgender people, and a whole lot of things in between. So some of you said you didn't know what the term gender fluid meant. Gender fluid falls on this spectrum here, which basically means your sense of your own gender isn't either just male or just female, that it's somewhere in between those binaries on a spectrum. Gender fluid. Trans typically means you were assigned a particular gender at birth. The doctor said you're male, but then when you began to know something about your own gender, you realized that wasn't exactly accurate. And trans people sometimes, though not always, make some sort of gender transition to either male, which is the female to male trans thing on the spectrum on this end, or female to male to female trans on this end. But a lot of people live in this in-between space and use terms like non-binary because neither male or female captures what their sense of gender is. They would prefer not to be gendered in that way. That's where we get terms, where we get pronouns like they and them. Where people want to go by they, them pronouns because he or him and she and her don't make sense to them. And there are also pronouns that have been created, like Z and Z-zer pronouns, which you'll see show up here and there, not as much as they and them. But these are people who live in between the 2 points on the ends of these spectrums. Gender expression, yeah.
So, regarding gender identity, can you help me understand the difference between how a person might understand their own gender inside and societal norms for masculine and feminine? Because I wonder, if there's a lot of imposition, and this gets maybe to gender presentation, how the world sees you. But is there an identity that people's sense of gender beyond men don't do it that way, women don't do it that way, clothing choices, which gets into your gender expression, but gender expression must start with gender identity, right? Where you're thinking, I don't feel like I'm a typical man, or I don't feel like I'm a typical woman. How's that separated from what I think are pretty destructive societal norms for what a man could be and a woman could be?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And it's really getting at the reality that gender itself is a construct. We have, over time, determined what we think male means and what we think female means, and what men dress like and women dress like, and what men do and how they act and feel and experience the world. And all of that is sort of culturally overlaid over time, over our bodies, in ways that we have acquiesced to, but that has not often really named reality for us. You know. And a really good book, this scholar is a terrific academic who's just written a book for a wider audience that I really love, Judith Butler. You all know Judith Butler? They are a professor at Berkeley who wrote a really amazing book in the 90s called Gender Trouble, which is almost impossible to read unless you are a scholar of gender and philosophy. But Butler has more recently, in the last couple of months, published a book called Who's Afraid of Gender? And they wrote that book specifically for a wider audience to understand exactly what you're saying here, the way that gender has been constructed over time, the way that we perform gender in certain ways that sometimes become oppressive to us. And Butler, in this book, is talking specifically about the way that gender has become such a politicized issue in our cultural context today.
Yeah.
So I really recommend that book. So Who's Afraid?
So to follow up,
Yeah.
if somebody who's identified as a man by their doctor at birth starts feeling that I am not who I was assigned, right? What are the criteria that they might use for that if it isn't the cultural, like, I mean, for me, I fully identify as male, but I don't enjoy a ton of stuff and I don't act in a ton of ways that are traditionally considered masculine. That's never been a problem for me. But I wonder what is it that, and maybe this is way too complicated, what do people identify in themselves that is gender specific that they would say, I am not this, if it isn't the cultural pylon that is supposed to be feminine or masculine?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, it is hard to say because I think it's so idiosyncratic in a lot of ways.
Right.
That people experience a particular part of their own gender in relation to how they see gender presented to them, but also experience something about their body, their experience of their body, that doesn't fit the category that has been applied to them.
Right.
And for, I think for a long time, that just wasn't named in any helpful way.
Right.
More recently, that's been named by trans people on their own terms, although actually not entirely on their own terms, because gender dysphoria has been in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders for a long time and needed oftentimes to be a diagnosis a trans person received to get gender-affirming care. So that's another example of how the producers of powerful discourse have named for us our realities. But that's gradually being taken back into the hands of trans people to name their own experiences. And then more recently, I think what we're seeing is a whole lot of people who are living in this in-between space on the spectrum, who are saying the constructs of male and constructs of female don't make any sense to how I experience my body, and I'm not going to acquiesce to those constructs.
And that takes, I can't imagine the amount of individual strength and wherewithal that you say, I'm not going to accept that.
Yeah.
Because when I was a kid, I was called Sissy, all the stuff, you're not a real man, all that kind of stuff, because of the things I enjoyed. I didn't like sports. I like music. I like art, all this kind of stuff. And everybody kept telling me, small town, rural community, that's not masculine. But I wasn't at odds with my own body. Physically, I was fine with what I was. But I couldn't understand why the things I enjoyed were not called masculine.
Right.
The community told me what I was supposed to be, and the church loudly told me what I was supposed to be. And I didn't know how to make peace with that at that point in time, as a teenager, at all.
Thank you for that very personal example. But yeah.
I had somewhat similar experiences in a small town school where I went through junior high and high school. And this was a school that had a really bad problem with bullying. And the bullies somewhere, this was in the early and mid-60s. And somewhere along the line, the bullies discovered sexual terms as another tool they could use in enjoying themselves. So I was one of their favorite targets, so I had all sorts of strange things said about me, including a number of terms I knew nothing about. And one of the curious things was they concluded I wasn't a real male because I wasn't interested in playing football.
Yeah, that's what I'm wondering.
Yeah, and that also gets at another really helpful point, that many LGBTQ people come to know something about ourselves through the insults that are hurled at us. Because that is often the first time anyone has said anything about our embodiment of sexuality or gender in the form of an insult. There's a great book by another philosopher, Dieter Erebon, who talks about insult as the way that often the identity begins to become constructed for LGBTQ people. But there's this really great way in which LGBTQ people have often taken things that were meant as insults and turned the weight back on the others, like the reclamation of the term queer is a really good example of that. And gay men of a certain generation often have a really hard time embracing queer as a term of identification because it was so painfully used as an insult. But gradually, that insulting term has become a term of unification to sort of be an umbrella term for LGBTQIA2S plus people to use as a term that brings us together, and a term that I think of as having a lot of rhetorical power because it maintains that dangerous memory of its insulting nature and origin. And it won't let you forget the fact that this was a term of derision that is now a term of pride. And that there's power from the strength of the weak in this case to take a term that was meant to cause us harm and to use it as a term to bring us together in solidarity. It's a powerful term, but also one with a really complicated history. Not everyone gets around that term in the same way. But it's an important one to name because it's one that you'll hear more and more as a term of identification these days.
Expression.
Okay, all right, I'll go to this question. Thank you. All right, gender expression, this is how you present yourselves to others, whether you present in a culturally more masculine way or a culturally more feminine way or in some kind of androgynous or non-binary way. And notice that this is a separate spectrum from gender identity because many people who identify, for example, as a trans man have to present themselves in a culturally feminine way for a lot longer than they wish to because of the imposition of parents, the imposition of bullying in school culture, the fear of losing a job if they came out and expressed their gender as a trans man or something of that sort. So someone could be living somewhere on this spectrum in a very different way than they're living on this spectrum for a whole host of reasons. Gender presentation, again, is also how others see you, the kinds of ways that people name the gender they think they're seeing in your own life, and then sexual orientation. This is about our romantic, our affectional attraction to others. And attracted to men on one end of the spectrum, attracted to women on another end of the spectrum, bisexual, pansexual, asexual, somewhere here in the middle. But even that spectrum gets complicated by the complicated nature of these spectrums. So this is all much hazier than we often have wanted it to be. We've wanted to name ourselves on a very strict binary of male and female, gay and straight. But what we are coming to some sense of both awareness and recognition of is that those binaries never really worked for us.
Did Kinsey deal with any of these, Cody, besides just sexual orientation? Did he? I don't get the impression he did.
No, others did, but I think Kinsey was mostly into the sexual orientation spectrum. Yeah.
What is demisexual?
Oh yeah, let's get some of the terms that you didn't recognize before. Demisexual, so that would go on this spectrum. Demisexual is typically used to mean someone who doesn't experience strong sexual attraction to anyone unless they have a strong emotional attraction to that person. So a demisexual person could be seen as being in a gay relationship, a lesbian relationship, a straight relationship, but the important part of the demisexual piece is that they're not necessarily sexually attracted to someone unless they have a strong emotional attraction to that specific person. That's usually how demisexual is used today. And I will just caveat all of these definitions by saying people use these terms to mean slightly different things sometimes, and the definition of these terms change over time. So today, that's typically what demisexual refers to.
Tomorrow?
Pansexual, someone else named that as one that you wanted to know more about. Anyone else want to say what
They don't care.
What?
Someone who doesn't care about their partner's identity.
Yes, so yeah, they're attracted to pan, a wide range of gender identities and expressions and presentations. That's not the part of their sexual attraction that necessarily attracts them. It's a broad term. Similar in some ways to bisexual, though bisexual, even in the term itself, is indicating something of a binary, someone who's attracted to both men and women. But I think pansexuality opens that up a bit more to say, it's not really about men and women, it's about my attraction to people for various reasons beyond the binary of male and female. What other terms do we need to hit? Or you have a question?
I was going to ask another question.
Oh, go ahead.
Well, okay, so part of the problem is that we don't really think in biological terms, that there really is much more in certainly nature has such a variety in it, and now human beings we are much more complex than we realize, but we don't think biologically, and the therapy field is kind of taken over by psychologists, which are not necessarily biologically oriented. And I also add that is the seminary connected with the program in human sexuality at the university?
It was for a really long time.
Yeah, it was for a long time when the ALC was still here, and we, when I was working at Lutheran Social Service, we would help put on these week-long things on understanding a variety of sexuality.
Yeah.
But that kind of disappeared when the ELC was born.
Interesting. I didn't know that was the time.
Yeah, it was.
Yeah. So it was
Yeah,
called
that was
SARS.
our big staff, what we would do, and it was mostly for doctors and pastors who had to deal with sexual issues, but really weren't well educated.
Yes, yeah.
It was about sexual attitude reassessments, that's what SARS stands for.
Sorry.
Sexual attitude reassessment.
Yeah.
Interesting. Sounds scary, but I'm sure.
Keep your eye open and look at your drops and everything, clockwork orange, but,
We don't have that particular program anymore, but I will say there are a lot, like last year, I offered a class on pastoral care and sexuality and gender identity. My colleague Anna Marsh in Through the Bible offered a course on gender in the Bible, gender sexuality in the Bible. My colleague in theology and ethics, Amy Marga, offered a kind of queer gender theology class that was more of a systematic theology style class. So there are offerings that introduce and help students to address LGBTQIA kinds of concerns and, straight sexuality too. So that's the cisgender piece of it. We'll get back to that term. But yeah, there's not quite that partnership with physicians in the U, though I have become really well acquainted with a few bioethicists at the U that I've been working with and talking about, and just recorded a podcast with one of them who's working on gender affirming care within the U system. He's the ethicist at Children's Hospital right here down the road, across from Abbott. So I don't know, I'm trying to form some partnerships with bioethicists that we're talking about this.
Someone asked about cisgender.
Cisgender.
Definition.
So Transgender is someone who does not identify with the sex assigned to them at birth. Cisgender is someone who does identify with the sex assigned to them at birth. So if you were born and the doctor says it's a girl, you grew up feeling very much like you were a girl and then a woman, then you would be cisgender. It's a name that just we needed to describe something that was not described by transgender. So that's the term we created for it, because cis means same, basically. What other terms did we not get to that you named?
I was just curious if you knew the history of the word gay, for example. Like, that's another word that meant something else
Yeah.
at one time.
Oh, I should know. But
I realize I could Google
I
that,
can't
but you know.
think of it. I know the history of the terms homosexual and heterosexual better, both of which were invented to describe a pathological sexuality. Heterosexual originally meant people who were engaged in straight sex, but non-procreatively. Then it became just people who were straight. And homosexual, of course, was invented in the late 1800s by the medical psychiatric discourse to describe the pathology of people who are attracted to the same sex. I don't know where gay comes from culturally, historically. That's a good question.
That's your assignment for the 23rd.
Okay, I'll be back in a few weeks to tell you about that. Anything else before we move on? Any other terms you need to?
I guess in light of today's text, I think I sense where God wanted Sabbath, because if God would have kept going, we would have had another alphabet. And I say that because the more, and I'm thinking of neighbor now, to me, the more letters creates more dissonance. And there's where I appreciate seeing Trevor as a spectrum.
Yeah.
Because, and I'll just give you this quick example of in the late 80s, early 90s, when the basically anything to do with homosexuality or the whole letters was, see, I've yet to come to be able to state it. Not from any resistance, just that my mind doesn't go that quick.
Yeah.
And I had a good friendship with a fundamentalist pastor. And we played basketball together at noon with other clerks. And he brought up about, you know, it's against the Bible. And I just said, Richard, I said, on a continuum, Richard was full of hair. I mean, from top to bottom. And I just said, on a continuum, Richard, I would put you as a 10 male.
So what?
10 as a male. Myself, I see myself as a 7. Interesting, he did not come back at that as you're nuts. And so I'm wondering how we can express our struggle with sexual identity without creating roadblocks for those that have not even begun to address it.
Yeah, it's a good question, because I think a lot of the dissonance that we do see is through the production of this sort of politicization of sexuality and gender identity, rather than a respectful curiosity about gender identity and sexuality. I think one of the things that I would say that's just really important, and I'm glad you named this, that if you don't know, you can't come up with an acronym, you know, you could just say like people across the sexuality and gender spectrum or something like that. You know, that's perfectly fine. You don't need to worry so much about getting all the letters right or in a particular order. And you know, when you encounter someone who's embodying a sexuality or gender identity different from one that you recognize or know, or using a term that you don't understand, it's fine to really just respectfully say, I'm not sure I'm familiar with that term. Would you mind telling me what it is? And then I'll do my own research to try to figure out more about it, but I'd love to hear what that means to you, or something like that. You know, just to be really compassionately curious, to say, I've never heard that term. What does that mean to you? And let them tell you what that means to you.
Yeah, it seems to me the power of this presentation here is people are identifying themselves now. They aren't being identified by a term that people empower. I don't like Joe. I've never liked it as a nickname. So I like people to call me Joseph, and that matters to me greatly. Probably stupidly, but it makes a difference. If somebody says, hey Joe, I wince inside. Okay, I mean, I should get over it. But I get this idea that could I just be called what I prefer to be called, rather than what you have decided you need to call me. It seems like just a basic human right and a human need. So I love that, however complicated it is. Like, I preached a sermon recently where I decided to cut it at LGBTQ. I had IA+, and then I thought, oh, it was slowing me down. And I just trusted that it would probably be okay. So I think about that, but what helps me is just knowing what we're trying to do is let people say how I like to be called and how I like to be identified. And that seems like pretty simple grace to offer people. Yeah.
Very helpful.
Yeah.
Thank you.
The beauty of this is all of us want to be seen. We all want to be seen in some fashion, you know, and recognized as valid human beings, and really. And these kinds of terms, you know, help the broader scope of humanity. Say, oh look, I do belong. I'm inbred on this.
And more than learning all the terms and all the letters and what they all mean, I think the most important thing for us to learn and to embody is a posture of compassionate curiosity toward the other. Not a suspicious scrutiny toward the other, but just compassionately being curious about what their life is like and what their experience of their bodies is about, and being able to ask compassionate questions about that when we don't quite understand what they mean. Yeah.
I think another concept that bears on this is the simple one of respect. As an example of that, I've taken issue with people a few times for referring to Theodore Roosevelt as Teddy, because every biography I ever read of Theodore Roosevelt said he greatly disliked being called Teddy. So I think just as a matter of respect for the man, we shouldn't call him that.
Amen.
Yeah.
Good company.
Recall all the teddy bears.
Yeah, right. They don't have.
Oh, we got about probably 10 more minutes,
Oh, okay.
or at least 10,
I
15.
think we have, I think it also helps to just recognize and take on board how much we impose that binary structure on the world. I mean, I find gender reveal parties really problematic because the whole thing is about what biological sex this coming child is going to be, but then we bring to that all of this additional weight of, you know, clothing and career expectations based around that one aspect. And, you know, what if the kid turns out to be intersex, or what if their sense of their own identity doesn't match that? Then you've already built in all of these expectations before the kid was even born, that then they have to somehow dismantle and shed. And the other part of that that's so difficult is that comes along with that is, as much as the spectrum is helpful in understanding, it's hard to wrap our minds around it. I think we just have to sort of hold that tension and acknowledge that, yep, that's kind of hard to wrap your head around, that it's not either or. Someone could be somewhere in this general area on this thing, and somewhere in that general area on that thing, and they're probably not like anyone else. That we don't have, neat categories, we have a whole bunch of uniquenesses. And, I think it helps to just acknowledge that that's something we're not used to, that's a way we're not used to thinking. And we can get there, but sometimes it's helpful to just recognize how ingrained
Yeah.
those things are and how deeply we have to uproot.
Yeah, and respect the pronouns that people wish to have used, respect the name that people wish to have used. It's really, a little annoying when people get upset about the proper use of they, them pronouns because of some hang up they have about the English language rather than recognizing the importance that this pronoun is for this person and their well-being and embodiment. Lots of questions and like 5 minutes left, so let me get a couple more.
Seriously, as somebody who likes English a lot, every time I find they, them, it's like, wait, I thought that was, and I have to think, could I suggest, that, and I'm very serious, that someone come up with a singular pronoun to represent?
Yeah, they have actually. Z, Z-I-E, and Zir, Z-I-R. Are used by some people, but it's
Can we
hard.
promote that? It
Well,
would be
so
very
what helped me with that is reading that the use of they
Yeah,
was standard for English several hundred years
Yeah,
ago.
right, yeah.
Because the sense that referring correctly to the gender, including they, if there was a mix of men and women, or it was, well, back then they wouldn't have cared about whether people were uncertain. Referring to the gender was more important than agreeing with the number.
But we live today, and it really,
But we're going back.
okay. So I would encourage the Z.
Yeah, the Z, I don't know that it's not what everyone prefers to use, and it hasn't quite caught on. But I'm just saying use the pronoun that people ask you to use, and that's the most respectful thing.
Yeah.
I do need to move on just a little bit, because I want to name one thing before.
Okay, in the world we live now where it was so global, and some of the most horrible rhetoric is coming out of some of the Muslim world and that area, yet in the Muslim culture, men are so close. Men hold hands, men are very, they do so much together, and my husband's Indian, and the same thing in that respect, that it's, that culture, you get confused being around them as to who are they and where do I fit. Does that fall into any of these discussions?
Well, I don't know if it falls into these exactly, but it does get at our earlier discussion about how the way in which we embody masculinity or femininity is a cultural construct. That there are things that straight men do in that culture that if straight men did it in our culture, it would seem really odd to people.
Right.
But in that culture, this is a really good example of the way that cross-culturally we can see how we have constructed what male and female means quite differently. I was way overly ambitious with this. This is like
You better come back and do it.
slide 2 of maybe 15. I do want to get to a couple things. I'm gonna bring this back next week. This is sort of post-affirmation. I'll probably bring some of these things back too. I want to name this though, because this is a really important part to get at the politicization of gender and sexuality. This is as of yesterday, June 1st. The ACLU is tracking 515 anti-LGBTQ bills across the US. And you'll notice Minnesota is colored in the darkest category, 16 plus bills that have been considered this year in Minnesota. I don't think any of them passed, not the anti-LGBT. There actually have been several LGBTQ affirming bills passed this year. Not the Equal Rights Amendment, unfortunately, but some others. And I'll also note that Texas is a biennial legislature, so that's why Texas doesn't have any, because they didn't meet this year. And next year, this number will go up because Texas will be meeting. This is a map that I want you to pay really careful attention to, because it is affecting the livability of life for LGBTQ people in the US, including in Minnesota. But right now, because of the trans refuge bill that passed in 2023 and signed into law, Minnesota has been a really important place for trans people to find refuge. This was last year. Over 220 of the 520 bills that were proposed passed, or that, not 220 passed, 220 were targeting trans people, and 70 of these bills passed last year in legislatures across the country. Here's what some of them did. Laws that banned gender-affirming care for LGBTQ, or for transgender youth. Laws that require misgendering of trans students in their schools. That the teacher can't call them by the name that they want to be called, by the gender that they want to be recognized as. Laws targeting drag performances, laws creating a license to discriminate, laws censoring school curriculum, including LGBTQ books and libraries and things of that nature. This year, the Minnesota legislature passed a ban on book bans. You might have seen that. Great. I was at another Lutheran church a few months ago preaching, and the pastor there said that there was a young mother and child in the congregation who had just moved to that congregation, the congregation had just moved to Minneapolis from Florida because the child is trans and the mother knew she had to get that kid out of Florida, because Florida is where a lot of these bills are passing right now. And they moved to Minnesota, and so many people right now are moving to Minnesota because it is a refuge for LGBTQ people. And this map over the next few years is going to get worse. And I want to encourage you as a congregation to ask, what it means for you and your church that Minnesota is a trans refuge. I have a friend in Texas who I was talking to a few weeks ago, whose church is basically running, kind of a pipeline to trans refuge states, raising money to be able to send families with their, adults and kids, to other states to get the trans-affirming care that Texas has made illegal. That the trans people in her church, and there are a lot of LGBTQ people in her church because it was created really as a safe space, a refuge for LGBTQ people, they cannot even get the blood work done in Texas that they would need to get gender-affirming care in another state. So they have to raise all the money to get to another state to get all of their trans-affirming care, and her church is doing that work of raising the money, getting people to places like Colorado, so that they can get the care they need. Now, you're in a different place, because in Minnesota, this is the place where people are coming for that kind of care. So I would love for you to be thinking about what this means for you as a congregation, that you live in one of the only states in the upper Midwest, one of the only states in the upper Midwest where LGBTQ rights and protections are on the books and are not under threat. They are sort of under threat, but these laws aren't typically passing here like they do in all of the surrounding states.
One thing that might be a source of comfort, maybe also a source of caution, is that this state has rather a history of minority positions, particularly in the extreme right-wing direction. Minority positions seem to think that their best chance of success is to make as much noise as possible. And that includes not only in the form of yelling and screaming, but also the form of introducing lots and lots of bills in the legislature that have no chance of passing. But we still need to watch out for that in case they actually do start having a large influence.
Yeah. And even though they're not passing here, all around you, there are states where these laws are passing, and people are having to come here. And if you live in a neighboring state, it's maybe a little easier, although these are really big states, but a little easier to get here. But people in this whole area are also experiencing the need for LGBTQ migration to get the kind of care and protections that they need. So I just want you to begin thinking about this as a church, what it means for you to be an affirming congregation with LGBTQ people whose lives are held in the sacred belovedness here. To be in the midst of a state where people are fleeing to this state in order to live with some sense of care and well-being. There's a call bound up in that, and I don't know what it is for you specifically as a congregation, but I do want churches in this area to take very seriously the work of care for LGBTQ people, because the things we didn't get to is the exponentially increased rate of homelessness among LGBTQ youth who are rejected by their families, the incredibly high rates of suicidality among LGBTQ people who are experiencing school bullying and violence, parental rejection, church violence, etc. School climates where 81.8% of 22,000 LGBTQ youth said that they felt unsafe in their school. And then what is going to be a boom of LGBTQ elders in all of our institutions very soon, and the ways that LGBT elder care needs to become a part of our conversations too. This is the subject of a book that I'm working on now with a colleague of mine in Boston to do some work on LGBTQ elder spiritual care. That's all the time we have. That's great.
Close, yeah.
Okay. Anything before we leave that you feel like you really need to say or ask? Some books I've read on
And
the
I'll just
subject.
mention, it's not next week, it's the 23rd.
Right, 23rd.
Okay.
I'll be back at 23rd. We'll hear some incredible stories of LGBTQ people whose lives have been bound up with the church in very beautiful and courageous ways for a really long time. And I guarantee that some of them are stories that you've never heard. And we'll wonder together what it means to more fully embody an LGBTQ affirming commitment by leaning into the wisdom of LGBTQ lives. What could we learn about faithfulness, about love, about community, about forgiveness, about our relationships with the divine, if we listened compassionately and curiously to the lives of LGBTQ people? That's what we'll do on the 23rd.